Hello, welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Hanna Libakova. I'm a journalist and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center. I'm delighted to welcome you at the event dedicated to the Atlantic Council paper on Belarus and the list of recommendations to the new US administration compiled by 4 amazing experts who join us today as speakers. Let me introduce them to you. Dr. Anders Oslund is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Melinda Herring is the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Ambassador John Herbst is the Director of the Eurasia Center. He previously served as the US Ambassador to Ukraine. Ambassador Alexander Verzhbo is a Distinguished Fellow with the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He previously served as the US Ambassador to Russia and was the Deputy Secretary General for NATO. Valery Kowalewski serves as Svetlana Tikhanovska's representative for international affairs. Although he was not involved in writing the paper, but he will provide the Belarusian perspective to what we will be talking about. So we have 1 hour and 5 speakers, and I want us to immediately kick off the discussion. But before we begin, this is a reminder that you can send your questions via Q&A on Zoom and post your comments on Facebook and Twitter. So my first question goes to John. As a presidential candidate in the US elections, Joe Biden condemned the appalling human rights abuses committed by the Lukashenka regime. And Belarus is a different place than it was in 2016 when Trump came to power. But I would say that setting a new direction for the US strategy toward Belarus will require not only the White House, but also Congress to take more of an interest in the region. So my question is, what should the US, why should the US care, and what is the US interest in Belarus?
The United States has a great interest in the sovereignty, territorial integrity of all the states in the post-Soviet area, including Belarus. And we also have a strong interest in promoting an open society in Belarus. Belarus is an important country to the west of Russia, to the east of Poland, bordering on NATO. We have had a consistent policy since the Soviet Union imploded of promoting, again, the sovereignty, the territorial integrity, and open society in Belarus. We have 2 principal interests here. On the one side, to make sure that Belarus remains independent of Moscow. In the past, this has led to a certain conflict, certain tension in our policy, because we also promote an open society, and Belarus has been ruled by a dictator, Mr. Lukashenka, for almost 30 years. And today, we have a plausible democratic movement, a powerful democratic movement in Belarus. And it's in our interest that this movement is able to thrive, since it represents the wishes of the Belarusian people, and not thrive to the point where it produces a Russian crackdown. So it's our interest to encourage and protect the democratic movement in Belarus, even as it challenges the autocracy of Lukashenko, and do things that will make it easier for Lukashenko to depart the scene and for the people of Belarus to achieve their goals, to elect, in fact, their own leader as they choose, without prompting a Kremlin crackdown.
Right, thank you for also being on time. Melinda, you've been following the situation closely. Please give us the latest update and tell us about some of the concerns, priorities, and needs of the Belarusian pro-democracy movement that the US can address on its side.
Great, thanks, Hannah. And I'd like to thank John, Anders, and Sandy for writing this quickly. And I'd also like to thank my team, Doug and Shelby especially, and Ashish for editing this so quickly. I think this is a really important report. So there are many needs in Belarus. The US government is not spending very much money on Belarus. Our assistance levels are paltry. They're about $30 million. We need to be spending more like $200 million to be meeting the immediate needs in Belarus. So Congress, I hope you're listening. State Department, I hope you're listening. We really need to ramp up our spending. Now, Belarusians, when this all started back in August, Belarusians They crowdfunded. They raised about $10 million using online platforms, which is amazing. In a relatively low income country, that they raise this amount of money so quickly, but they can't keep giving and giving. So that's where European assistance and American assistance needs to come in. The problem, though, is that there's all kinds of limitations on moving money into Belarus. A, it's a security state. B, we have COVID, and people can't move in and out of the country very easily. So this has to be handled sensitively. The folks that I'm talking to say that cryptocurrencies are the way to do it, but there's a bigger problem. The US government is not very good at moving money. They are tied up in all kinds of reporting requirements. The European Union has the same issues, but we need to think more creatively. We need to be more creative. If we don't think with some new creative energy, this protest movement is going to fizzle out. So it's time to go back to the drawing boards and talk to people who are good at moving money and make it happen now.
Thank you. I'd like now to ask Sandy about this Moscow's dilemma in Belarus and what are some potential Kremlin responses to the Belarusian crisis?
Yes, thanks, Hannah. I would say first about Moscow's dilemma that they face a dilemma similar to what they faced in the so-called color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia back at the start of this century, and of course in 2014 in Ukraine. And the dilemma is that Moscow knows that its preferred leader has lost legitimacy, and they might even want to ease him out of power. But Moscow simply doesn't want to validate the idea that the people of Belarus should be allowed to choose their own leader, and not least to do so through street protests. So this phobia about spontaneous protests leading to regime change has led Moscow to make policy choices, even in the initial days after the stolen election in August, that have painted it into a corner. They didn't worry before August that the Belarusian people dreamed of EU or NATO membership. I think they saw Belarus as far more friendly towards Moscow, even if it preferred to stay independent, didn't want to become part of the Russian Federation. But they clearly underestimated the pent-up dissatisfaction among the people after 25 years of Lukashenka's rule, and they were as surprised as he was by the massive protests that followed the manipulation of the election results. So caught by the surprise, they maybe Putin let his obsession with preventing regime change through protests get the better of his judgment. He quickly endorsed the legitimacy of the official election count. He closed off options for dialogue, refused to talk to Tsikhanovskaya, declared the Coordination Council illegal, basically effectively lined himself up with the repression and the mass arrests that Lukashenko was carrying out. He more recently has tried to distance himself from Lukashenko, and that may be what will continue to happen over the coming weeks, trying to not only persuade Lukashenko not to run again in new elections, but to try to bring these elections forward through a constitutional reform. But it's not clear that that reform's going anywhere. Lukashenko is backpedaling fast from his commitment to step down after the next elections. And the situation seems to be getting more and more polarized. So that nightmare scenario that Moscow is trying to avoid may be coming, particularly if the protests continue every weekend as they have, which is quite an impressive display of courage by the Belarusian people.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been more than 170 days of the protest. Anders, you are one of the leading experts in economic policy. So from the economic point of view, how does this dilemma look for Lukashenko? The Belarusian economy is already dependent on Russia when it comes to export and import, but I was wondering, is there any room that this dependence may even increase? And basically, I'm wondering about whether there is any room on the side of Russia to buy more Belarusian products.
Yeah, first, if we take the general problem of the Belarusian economy, it can be said to be two things. One is that the economy has been literally stagnant since 2012. And the reason is that it's a semi-reformed Soviet economy and it can't perform better than it does. So it requires fundamental reforms, and Lukashenko is not prepared to do that. because if he privatizes a big company, then he loses the power over them. And the other problem is a short-term financial problem. And that's what he really cares about. So Lukashenko today has only reserves for about 1 month of imports. Normally said it should be for 3 months. And he has $3 billion of cash. He needs $6 billion more to carry this cover this year. And traditionally there are two sources to get that. One is from the IMF, and that is not available because the IMF is not prepared to deal with Lukashenko because he is normally cheating them, and they know that. And the other source is Russia. Putin declared when Lukashenko came to his knees to Putin in Sochi on the 14th of September that he's ready to give $1.5 billion as loans. But Lukashenko needs much more. And what Putin hinted at, it is that Russian private money can come in and buy the big companies. And the Belarusian economy is quite concentrated to a few big companies. So there are 4 big companies, 2 fertilizer plants and 2 oil refineries that account for 2/3 of Belarus's exports to the West. And then where do they get the raw material from? Oh, the oil comes from Russia, and the gas for one of the fertilizer plants come from Russia. So the natural thing is that Russian private businessmen buy these Belarusian companies. We have seen it before. It has happened with gas assets in Belarus, and half of one of the refineries is already bought by Russian companies. But where does the money come from? It comes from Russian state banks. So what Putin is essentially saying, it is a couple of my most loyal oligarchs are allowed to get billions of dollars of Russian state bank financing in order to buy Belarusian companies cheaply. And that would completely tie up the Belarusian economy. And this is what we have to avoid.
Yeah, the question is whether Lukashenko would ever sell, those 4 enterprises, because it means basically losing control over the Belarusian economy. Valery, I would like to ask you now, since the US president has had a call earlier today with Vladimir Putin, and they basically discussed the protest in Russia, but they did not mention Belarus. In your opinion, what are Belarusians expecting from the new US administration? Are they expecting the US to promote democracy, to lead by the power of example?
Yeah, well, thank you, Hannah. Yeah, definitely was interesting to see that President Biden did not mention Belarus in this call, just Navalny and Ukraine, not just, but still, Belarus was missing. Definitely that we expect more attention, that Belarus will be on the agenda, on the standing agenda, and until this crisis is resolved. Biden has expressed a lot of interest in the situation in Belarus. He showed himself as fairly well informed about the events in Belarus, and he was very vocal in kind of demanding the action and kind of defining the policy of the United States government. At this stage, I think the most important and sort of Belarusians are waiting for very specific steps that would be tangible and that would be impactful. And number one is fast reintroduction of economic sanctions. And you might know that the United States has imposed the sanctions since long, but they were suspended when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the United States and the European Union decided to re-engage with Belarus and normalize relations, and that was one of the steps that they made. They introduced a waiver to the sanctions, and now they are in the suspension state. The other one would be to continue non-recognizing the Lukashenko's legitimacy, as he is not a legitimate ruler of Belarus at the moment. Very important would be to start implementation of the Belarus Democracy, Human Rights and Sovereignty Act that was adopted just last year. And actually it was adopted in a very kind of fast pace in just 3 months since introduction in the House. But the whole act has a kind of arsenal of tools, of mechanisms to influence the situation in Belarus, to influence the behavior of Lukashenka. One of them, for example, is the request to the US intelligence community to prepare a report about the financial assets of Lukashenka. And he has done a lot to damage the Belarusian economy, to steal the money from people. So there's a lot to learn from us. Finally, it is very important for the US to engage with Russia, to first deter it from abusing the weakness of Lukashenka, but also to prevent it from supporting Lukashenka's violence against peaceful protesters. Russia has a potential to be a constructive force in this conversation, and in Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's office, we are always underscoring that we are willing to see Russia being part of the concert of nations, finding a solution that would be a peaceful solution to the crisis in Belarus under the conditions that it respects sovereignty and independence of Belarus. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let us come back to discussing some of the specific recommendations that are included in this great report that you guys wrote. John, I would like to ask you to tell a little bit more about how, what can the West do to strengthen the pro-democracy movement in Belarus. Valery already mentioned some of these points that are included in the report, which is non-recognition of Lukashenko's legitimacy, or reintroduction of the economic sanctions, though report says about sanctions, but sanctioning companies that handle Lukashenko's private finances. So perhaps you can elaborate more on those specific recommendations that you included in the report.
Okay, we offer a slew of recommendations, which I would categorize in 5 different baskets. The first is to promote the legitimacy of the opposition in Ms. Tsikhanouskaya and the delegitimization of Lukashenko. So, for example, our ambassador, when she goes out, Julie Fisher, a wonderful diplomat, should not present her credentials to Lukashenko. She should be spending most of her time in Vilnius near Ms. Tsikhanouskaya. 2, we should organize the US government to manage this crisis. So we should have a senior coordinator to manage sanctions against the Lukashenko regime and maybe against appropriate Russians. And also we should have a senior official designated to manage assistance to the opposition and to the people of Belarus. And finally, this combines both organization and resources. We should double the budget of RFE and RL so we can get out our message to the people of Belarus. The third category is to increase specific support to the opposition. So, for example, Melinda already mentioned the need to get resources to the opposition using cryptocurrency. We should also push to for the legitimacy of the opposition. The next element is to keep Russia out of the conflict. I mean, they're already in. We've seen what they've done by sending media experts, for example. But this involves, I'd say, a series of measures that have to be conducted simultaneously. 1, we don't want to frighten the Russians into thinking that Belarus is now going to become part of the West. So we would encourage the opposition not to talk about NATO, not to talk about the EU, to talk simply about the need for Belarus to choose its own president. 2, with the EU, we should be in dialogue with Moscow about the crisis in Belarus. But 3, we should send a very clear signal to Moscow that if they intervene with their repressive apparatus, whether with their secret police, with their regular police, with their military, to repress the people of Belarus, or to prop up Lukashenko, or a Lukashenko-like alternative, there will be serious sanctions against the Russian economy, against Russian officials. So these are the basket of recommendations that we put out there to increase the chance of success for the opposition while Belarus maintains its sovereignty and its territorial integrity.
Great, thank you. So among those recommendations that you mentioned, there was this point about doubling the budget of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And RFRL has become the main source of information during the pandemic and during the protest in Belarus. Melinda, I would like to ask you why the US can make a difference by supporting RFRL, and why is it important?
Sure. Thanks, Hannah. So RFERL is indispensable. Just to make a very obvious point, there's no free media in Belarus. There's a couple of independent media sources that are indispensable. RFERL is at the top of this list, and it's really inexcusable. The last administration did not surge funding. They were supposed to surge funding, and they didn't do it, and they were caught up in all kinds of dumb domestic disputes in the United States. I hope Congress digs in and asks for an answer on why it wasn't done. So hopefully we have a new head of the organization that oversees RFERL. That's the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Hopefully they will finally increase the funding. And then also Congress needs to speak out very forcefully, and the leadership of RFERL and USAGM when Belarusian journalists, RFERL's journalists, are pulled into jail and when they're harassed. That's a really important part as well. And then also to provide the legal legal resources to get people out of jail. I wanted to add one other item to John's list, and it's symbolic, but I think it's really important. Everyone cares right now who gets the first phone call or the second phone call, right? We have a new president. He's been in office, in a very short time. President Biden needs to invite Svetlana Tikhanovskaya to come to Washington. I know it's COVID. She can still get on an airplane. They could wear masks. But it's time to prioritize this and invite her to come to Washington in his first 100 days. She should be at the top of his list for foreign visits.
Thank you, Melinda, for this great remark. I have another point in this report that I would like to discuss. I would like to ask Sandy about one of these recommendations that says that Biden administration should privately caution the opposition to avoid any signal suggesting its interest in joining the EU or NATO. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, John talked about this briefly a minute ago, but I think the point is what are the best tactics to advise Belarusian opposition as they try to manage a very delicate situation. Clearly, we've seen in recent years that whether you're looking at Georgia or Ukraine, that Russia's biggest worry is that neighboring states under pressure from the streets are going to turn away from Moscow, seek closer relations with the EU and NATO, and even seek membership. And that's, I must say, is perfectly within the rights of the Belarusian people. It's guaranteed under the Helsinki Final Act, under the Paris Charter, and many other agreements. But clearly, we have to reckon with the possibility that the Russians will go all out to deny them this right, whether it's installing a pro-Russian government, intervening militarily, establishing the military bases in Belarus that, to his credit, Lukashenka has tried to resist. So our recommendation was sort of in this delicate moment, the best tactics may be to do anything to avoid giving Russia a pretext to overreact and continue to talk about freedom to choose your own leaders as the driving force for this movement. And this is not about the geopolitical orientation of Belarus. We're not saying they should renounce any aspirations in the longer term, but maybe just don't talk about them at the moment.
Yeah, well, it's just interesting to see how it's changing anyway, right? And how Belarusians are kind of turning, becoming more pro-Europeans instead of being more pro-Russians. And, the pro-Russian moves actually are decreasing.
Yeah, and the Russians are sometimes the best recruiters for the West. In terms of, we've seen this in Ukraine with a much more congealed national identity that sees Ukraine's place squarely as part of the Euro-Atlantic community. And that could happen in Belarus too. So the Russians' heavy-handed tactic is often their own worst enemy.
Yeah, and perhaps they're making the same mistake as they did in Ukraine, right? By supporting Lukashenka.
Yeah.
Anders, I was wondering, there are two recommendations in the report that are saying about sanctions. So firstly, the United States should sanction companies that handle Lukashenka's private finances, and the United States should threaten Russian companies and businessmen with sanctions in case they take over some of the kind of strategically important Belarusian enterprises. That's basically what you wrote in some of your articles, that Belarusian state-owned enterprises should not be sanctioned because that would make the Belarusian economy even more dependent on Russia. Could you elaborate on that? And could you perhaps mention some of the examples when it happened previously that that those sanctions made the economy kind of more dependent on Russia?
I'm sorry, Anders, it seems that you're muted.
You should, you should sanction the culprit and not the victim. And if you sanction a Belarusian company because it's taken over by a Russian company, then you are sanctioning the wrong person. So it will speak concretely. Russia has a big potash company, Uralkali, which seems to have designs on taking over Belaruskali. We saw that in 2011. Belaruskali is an enormous company. It produces 20% of all potash, which is a good fertilizer in the world. And Uralkali produces 18% of potash. They used to operate together as monopolistic consortium, and the Russians want to do that again. And surprise, surprise, Uralkali is controlled by a Belarusian called Dmitry Mazepin, and he wants to take over Belaruskali. He is also well positioned by being chairman of a Belarusian Russian business council. So this is Putin's prime person. And just in order to make sure that we understand that, he has got, if I got it right, $5 billion of personal loans from VTB, the Russian state bank. And he's now getting another billion from Sberbank, the other big Russian state bank. So he is positioned to take over this company, and also Grodno Azot, where he has another company, Uralchem, that is supposed to take over these two companies. It's Mazepin, Uralchem, and Uralkali, the Russian companies that should be sanctioned. Also, Sberbank and VTB, if they participate in this operation, and not the Belarusian companies, because then Belarus will only be more dependent on Russia. And on the other hand, we have a potash lobby in the United States that is very friendly to the Belarusian civil society activists and strongly argue for sanctions against Belaruskali. You can gather why. This is simply a protectionist lobby. If they manage to get Belaruskali sanctioned, it will not disappear. If Belarus manages to get rid of Lukashenko, it will stick. We have seen this many times before, in particular with the Jackson-Vanik amendment from 1974, which was there in order to force Brezhnev to let Jews emigrate to Israel. And it has been maintained for all the post-Soviet countries, regardless of them having no part in it, until very late. For example, Moldova got rid of it in 2012. I was engaged in that, and that was a big, hard struggle. If you get US sanctions imposed upon you, it's very difficult to get rid of them. They are sticky, and the sanctions should hit the culprits, the Russian companies, oligarchs and companies, and not Belarusian companies. We want integration of Belarus with the West, not the opposite.
Here, I would like to ask Valery whether you, Valery, agree with Anders' point. I imagine that you might agree on the point about sanctioning, targeting Russians, but what do you think about actually those Belarusian state-owned companies? Do you think they should be sanctioned?
Well, I would like to offer two perspectives on this. One is geopolitical, and the other one is socio-economic. So the geopolitical perspective is that Lukashenko has always used Russia as sort of a counterbalancing argument, like don't push me, don't introduce sanctions, don't introduce economic or political sanctions, because this will push me towards Russia, in Russia's embrace. So that sort of paralyzed essentially policies in the West, in the European Union, in the United States. Like, we don't want Belarus to be part of Russia. Like, so we should probably kind of protect Lukashenko from this stress of imposing economic sanctions, especially economic sanctions. So time and again, Lukashenko used this argument, and he was fairly successful. Eventually sanctions would be removed and he would go back to normal. The problem with this argument that Lukashenko might be pushed towards Russia is that Lukashenko is already very close to Russia, and he is very dependent on Russia, and he cannot do much without Russia's sort of influence or Russia's opinion on things. Therefore, we need to be careful in in the assessment of his proximity to Russia. At the same time, Lukashenko is very suspicious of Russia, so this pressure from the West will eventually force him to be cognizant of the consequences of him moving closer to Russia. He is as much suspicious of Russia as he is suspicious of the West, because he sees both these centers of force of international influence as challenging his grip on power. Therefore, he will always be trying to protect himself from undue influence from Russia too. So the other one is socioeconomic perspective, and one of the very popular arguments we hear is that economic sanctions can be detrimental to the well-being of ordinary people who have nothing to do with politics. The problem is that, especially in this in this political crisis, we saw that Lukashenko has closed 400 businesses since the election day, and those businesses that were simply sympathetic to the protest movement, they would not be supporting them with funds. They would be just displaying, let's say, symbols of the protest: white, red, white flags. And that could be the reason for the authorities to go after those businesses, to find them, to bankrupt them, to force them out of the country. So in this case, the government, the authorities, doesn't care much about the well-being of people at all. They destroy jobs, they destroy businesses, they force them out of the country. And so this is a strange conundrum here when we see the West being concerned about the well-being of the people of Belarus, while the government is putting this enormous economic pressure on the people, harassing businesses, forcing them to close, destroying the jobs, bankrupting them. And again, at the same time, the West is caring more about Belarusian people than Lukashenko himself. So we are seeing essentially here internal sanctions against people who are vocal, who have courage to have some kind of civil rights or civil movement position. So we have to be also aware of this situation and measure our response. Belarusian people in general are supportive of sanctions. They want to have prompt, effective, impactful action from the West. They have not seen it since August. They're disappointed, they're frustrated, and they're tired of unwillingness and inability of the West to be more resolute in responding to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Valery. Well, I might add to that between 2004 and basically, the beginning of last year, sanctions were introduced 17 times, and there were different kind of stages, I guess, of relationship between Belarus and Russia. And there were moments when Belarus was indeed more dependent on Russia, and then it just switched to the West. And it kind of was not influenced, I guess, by the US sanctions. So we have plenty of questions from the audience, and I would like to ask you. So we have a question from Mark Lindsay. So he is asking about the protest in Russia. And there is an opinion that they are very bad for Lukashenko. Yeah, that's basically a question. Do you agree with that? And I guess this is Sandy who might be willing to take that question. It's the first one, and it says, yeah, it's basically it's about kind of consequences, I guess, for Lukashenko when it comes to the protests in Russia and how Putin might react and what it brings to Belarus.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. Which is Russia going to affect Belarus? Is Belarus going to affect Russia? It's very interesting times we live in. I think the first question is, what's going to happen next in Russia? Clearly, Putin's immediate goal is to do whatever he thinks he needs to do to prevent the protests from last Saturday from gaining traction and starting to recur every weekend like they're doing in Belarus. Uh, I think his biggest fear is that even though the numbers on Saturday, while impressive, weren't gigantic, if they grow, this could become a nationwide resistance movement, really representing the biggest threat to the Putin regime in a decade or maybe ever. Uh, anyway, so he clearly is focusing on preventing a movement from emerging. Uh, but I think what's happening surrounding Navalny is probably going to reinforce Putin's resolve to ensure that the revolution or the resistance in Belarus does not succeed. Uh, so he'll be focusing more on the home front, but I think he'll be more determined than ever to somehow engineer an outcome in Belarus that doesn't validate the opposition's ability to change the regime by force. He's going to maybe accelerate his efforts to find some pro-Russian political figures or create new parties as a way of bringing the crisis to an end without losing face. Lukashenko, of course, will be trying to sort of preserve his place and renege on his commitment to step down even after some delay. But the two are clearly going to feed on each other, and it's very hard to predict exactly what happens next.
Yeah, that's very true. I think as much as protesters might actually feed each other, the dictators, the two of them could do the same. So there are two sort of similar questions. I might combine them. This is for Melinda, I imagine. So the first question is about where does $200 million come from? Why this figure? How do you see that being spent and on what? And another question is about this difficulty of providing support to Belarus, which you mentioned. Is there any room for Ukraine to step up and help the West in supporting the Belarus democracy movement? Or is Ukraine too busy with its own problems? And I know that you're a great expert on Ukraine, so.
Thanks, Hannah. Okay, so the $2 million figure is not just a made-up figure. It's not a back of the napkin figure. That figure comes from activists in Belarus, and there's sort of specific breakdowns. So part of it is support for civil society, part of it support for media. There's all kinds of ideas on countering internet censorship and repressive surveillance technology. There's solidarity funds that are needed. There's funds that are needed to support Belarusian identity and language. There's a long list. There's money that's needed to support independent trade unions and striking workers. So you could do more than 200, but 200 would make a big dent. That's the bottom line. I think that Ukraine could definitely play a role here. And there's a lot of Belarusians who are in Ukraine. One of the more interesting things I found in my section of the report, I focused on the domestic picture, is where Belarusians have gone since August. So Belarusians have gone to Kiev, they've gone to Riga, they've gone to Vilnius, and they've gone to Warsaw. And they're creating massive civil society organizations that are helping people who had to leave quickly. And many of the people in Kiev are students, so you can help students. You can, you can send them pizza. You can provide a house for them. You can do very basic things. Zelensky can also offer his rhetorical support. That would be a wonderful thing for Ukraine to do. Hannah, I saw there was one other question too about what can be done to support women's organizations. The good news is, beyond just giving money, The good news is that the big women's organization is in Riga. So focus on the work that's already being done, dig in and look at what they're doing there. But you're not going to face the same kind of financial constraints because the organization's in Riga and outside of Belarus.
All right, thank you. There are two questions about the role of international organizations, which I consider very interesting. So the first one is from Tony. So do speakers envisage any opportunities for involving the OSCE to work towards a political solution in Belarus? And would the US prefer the EU to take the lead on Belarus? And the other one is about the UN Security Council and the role of it. Who would like to take this question? I think Valeria for sure.
Yeah. So OSCE is an important platform that we at the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya are looking at as possible mediator, as sort of the platform to bring together the constructive forces to help mediate the crisis. At the same time, we don't see much willingness from the Belarusian authorities to see this happening. So OSCE at this point of time is sort of dormant, but we're looking for ways to employ it more effectively. Right after the crisis, after the crackdown in Belarus, OSCE prepared a very helpful, very informative report with excellent recommendations, 65 recommendations actually, Moscow Mechanism report, beautifully written document that kind of depicts very clearly the depth of the crisis in Belarus. We still need to figure out how to move it forward, how to implement all these recommendations. As far as the EU is concerned, it's our hope that the United States will step in and step up to the status of the leader of the free world and help the EU, as well as UK and Canada, to combine forces, to coordinate the efforts and multiply them in responding to the crisis. As far as the United Nations Security Council is concerned, there's a hope that this, in our opinion, the crisis in Belarus qualifies to be introduced for the discussion, for the review at the United Nations Security Council. We've already had two meetings, area formal meetings that were Svetlana Tikhanovskaya herself participated in, where we raised the problems of the crackdown on peaceful protests, but also of free media in Belarus, and they were really effective in shedding the light on the problems. But we're thinking about other ways to use United Nations Security Council to resolve the crisis in Belarus, because it has all the perspectives of spilling over and becoming a real threat to the international peace and security. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think it's important also to ask the authors of the paper, do you think the US can kind of take or at least contribute to this kind of looking for solutions, under the OSCE or the UN Security Council or any other institution? And how do you see the partnership, this transatlantic partnership, and kind of, the collaboration between the US and the EU when it comes to the solution of the Belarus crisis? John, would you like to take this question?
Sure. Look, for there to be a good outcome in this crisis, you need strong American leadership. We know the EU is often reluctant to challenge Moscow, and they need our encouragement to make that happen. And we need to work with the EU because together we're stronger and more effective. But it's important to keep in mind that you can't really expect the Security Council at the UN, or for that matter, the OSCE, to play a positive role unless the other actors in the story, meaning Lukashenko on the one hand and Mr. Putin on the other, are willing to let them play that role. And this is where strong American diplomacy along the lines that our recommendations suggest, meaning potential sanctions on Moscow and on Russian actors, sanctions on Lukashenko and those propping him up within Belarus, and also downplaying, at least for now as a tactic, as Sandy pointed out, any aspirations that the opposition in Belarus may have to join the Western security and economic structures. leave that for another day. Let's make sure the opposition can win in Belarus. Let's make sure that Moscow does not crack down. And we make sure Moscow does not crack down by not saying things that induce the hawks there to gain influence, but also laying down very serious sanctions if Moscow proves to be an aggressor in Belarus.
If I could add 2 words to that, I agree with what John just said. But there was a question from Valentina Holubeva questioning why we should support a constitutional reform led by Lukashenko, which would be by definition illegitimate. And I agree with that. I think the West has to be very careful to kind of play a neutral or agnostic role on the details of these kinds of things. But putting the OSCE in the role of a mediator may be a way of ensuring that any constitutional reform kind of is more legitimate, meets international standards, and is serving mainly as what I think it's intended to serve as a face saving mechanism to ease out Lukashenko and bring more legitimate government with the opposition coordinating council full participants rather than the odd man out or odd woman
Right.
out.
If I could just jump in for a second. At the moment Moscow realized that it has to let Lukashenko or a Lukashenko type go, the OSCE becomes a mechanism where we can make this work. And even the Security Council can play a positive role at that point.
Right.
If I can briefly follow up on John's point, speaking about the geopolitical choices of Belarusians, like willingness to join any Western organizations. From the very beginning, it was a key feature of the protest that it was non-geopolitical. It was not pro-Russia or anti-Russia, not pro-West or anti-West. It was purely focused on the domestic agenda. Kind of people wanted democracy. People wanted to make their own choices about who governs the Belarusians. Therefore, at this point in time, and we don't foresee that there will be serious changes in geopolitical orientations of Belarusians, but this is not on the agenda. Thank you.
Right. So there is a question from Jakob Wallenstein, a very important one, and everybody is asking about that. Is the new US ambassador actually going to go to Minsk, and what would that mean for non-recognition of the regime's legitimacy? Well, Valeria, I know more or less your position, but let me ask perhaps John, you or Melinda. I know that we discussed that before.
We cannot speak for the Biden administration, and we recommend in our own report that that Ambassador Fisher not present her credentials to Mr. Lukashenko. I would be very surprised if she were to go to Minsk to present credentials to Lukashenko. She may go to Minsk, but for other purposes. But we'll have to wait and see. But I would strongly advise against it.
Right. Valeria, would you like to add anything here?
I would consider that, or I would rather suggest that when sending the ambassador to Belarus, we should be mindful that the conditions to perform ambassadorial functions in Belarus will be very, very difficult, very challenging. And so what could be done right now, being on the ground? The idea is to have the eyes and ears and feet on the ground and to be effective in performing the functions of ambassador. But the government, the regime is really tough on diplomatic corps. They have developed really effective approaches to keep diplomatic corps of the West in Minsk in check. So it is it should be considered as well. And the other one is that the regime will definitely use this for propaganda purposes, and they will show it to everybody in Belarus, like to the civil society, to the protest movement, like, look, the United States has recognized me. I'm fine now. It's gonna be okay. Just like every time before, we will overcome. We will prevail, and the United States is here with me, and there is no reason to protest any longer. And this will definitely it might be impactful for people, kind of for their sense of abandonment by the West once again. Thank you.
Let me just add here that the US has strong precedences on this. For example, when martial law was introduced in Poland in 1981, John Scanlon was appointed US ambassador. He stayed in Washington for his whole period. So my guess is that if Julie Fisher goes out of Washington, which is not obvious, she's likely to stay in Vilnius for the reasons that Valeri just mentioned, and because of a strong US president. The US would not allow its ambassador to be denigrated, as Valeri just suggested.
Right, thank you. So there are several comments and questions from Serge Khretonov. He also kind of mentions the point about the constitutional reform, that it can't be done before the election, which is something that the pro-democracy movement is also aiming at, saying that any reform can be done only like after the election or during the new election. So that's kind of the new fair and free election is the kind of main goal. However, the question is about sanctions. What's the approximate time frame of sanctions to reach their goals? What are their goals? And I guess, Anders, this is to you.
The aim of the sanctions is to put sufficient pressure on Belarus so that Lukashenko has to go. This is really a regime change group of sanctions. So therefore, it's natural to increase them. What we did not discuss is that also more and more people who have been involved in repression should be sanctioned. And this is people who have been involved in torture, and also people who are disinformation agents, that they should be sanctioned. And of course, also the Russians who have been involved in that. And the Belarusian civil activists are doing a very good job in identifying hundreds of these. The US traditionally sanctions rather few people. The EU tends to sanction more. I think that in this case, one should go for hundreds of people. And then people raise, but what does it matter that we are sanctioned? Many of these people have summer houses or enjoy going to Jurmala in Latvia or to Palanga in Lithuania, which are a short car drive from Belarus. This should not be possible. So it is meaningful to sanction people lower down in the ranks also. And there should be a strong incentive not to help Lukashenko, because I also see the question, why are so many people in the security forces still working for Lukashenko? That is where we need to change the incentive structure. So normally regime change sanctions don't succeed, but Lukashenko's regime is very weak. And therefore I think that it could succeed, as we saw in the cases of South Africa and Rhodesia, which are successful regime change sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you. And there were already kind of good examples when sanctions actually led to changing kind of the situation, or at least the approach of the Belarusian authorities in 2008, in 2014. So there is a question from Denis Kozakiewicz. Don't you afraid that being too soft on Lukashenko might be perceived by Putin as implicit encouragement of violations of human rights? For example, he might reckon that torturing people would seem acceptable by the West. Sandy, would you like to take that one? You're muted.
There you go. Yeah, I'm not sure I accept the premise of the question that we are being too soft on Lukashenko. If we were trying to prop him up in the midst of this popular movement to oust him, then we could be accused of that. But I think we are, like the Europeans, refusing to recognize him as the legitimate president anymore, and condemning quite sharply the use of force and the mass arrests and the torture and everything else that's going on. So I think we're on the right side of that issue. We just have to keep it up and ensure that we bring as many other partners in the international community to speak with the same voice as we are doing. That's the traditional American leadership role that John referred to with this administration. I think you'll see more of it, particularly when it comes to crises in Europe and in the former Soviet space.
Yeah, I think it was also kind of about this rhetoric saying that we cannot provoke the Kremlin and kind of we cannot make them angry. So this might be perceived as weakness, as kind of the as
Well, again, it's more how to help your partner get what he or she wants, and that requires, in a situation like this, very careful judgment regarding tactics. Doesn't mean compromising your strategy. So I think we're approaching this as friends of the Belarusian people on what can bring a positive outcome. But we do know Moscow has the potential to overreact, and we have to at least think that through. But ultimately, putting the interests of the Belarusian people and their rights under the Helsinki Final Act front and center.
Right, thank you. I have a question from George Kroll, and this would go to Melinda and John. I think beyond seeing Lukashenko leave power, what else unites or may unite all those Belarusians who want him out? What do panelists think will happen realistically in Belarus after Lukashenko? Any comparisons to Ukraine?
I'll give one sentence and then John can finish it up. One of the things that's striking when you look at all the reporting that brought people together in August was how poorly Lukashenko responded to the COVID crisis. He pretended that nothing was going on, that people should get on their tractors, that they should drink vodka. And his lack of leadership and lack of governance really led people to question his legitimacy. So I think that's one of the things, this terrible governance that really brings the middle class together on the streets. Thanks. John, you can finish it up.
Look, it's hard to predict first how this crisis will play out. But if Lukashenko leaves, and if he's not replaced by, again, a Lukashenko-type authoritarian figure, I think then Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, or if this is a result of a broader compromise, whoever emerges at the top of that broader compromise with the opportunity to govern in Minsk and begin to address the problems of the country. And if that figure, whoever it is, Ms. Tsikhanouskaya or someone else, does not succeed, well, someone else will appear. But what we're very clearly seeing, and it's been extraordinary, is the people of Belarus are saying no to 3 decades of tyranny. And they're saying it resolutely. And I think they'll have the opportunity to, in this case, if this plays out in a positive way that I've just described, they'll have the chance to determine their own future with a leader who will be able to provide the leadership they need. And if a specific leader doesn't do that, that specific leader will be replaced. We have an old saying in American politics, and this is a good saying, although it sounds rather rough, that if you don't like the guy, throw the bum out, right? But let it be done democratically. Let it be done in connection with the wishes of the people. And I think Belarus will be a much better place.
Hanna, if I may come in here, I see Dan Fried is also in the chat, and he and I were both involved in Poland around 1980. But what we are seeing now in Belarus is much more like Poland 1980-81. I was working as a Scandinavian consul in Szczecin at the time, so I saw when Solidarity was founded, and that was the kind of national movement that we are seeing in Belarus. What happened in Ukraine, both in 2004 and 2014, was very different because it was divided. It was part of a country against the other part of a country. Belarus today looks completely united. You could also draw a parallel between the People's Fronts in the 3 Baltic states from 1987 until 91. And what typically happens later on is that they divide in political parties, but not in the beginning. So first, democracy. So the Belarusians are perfectly right. We are doing what the Poles did in the 1980s. Good for you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that's a great moment and actually a great phrase to finish the panel. Thank you very much for joining. That was an Atlantic Council event on the paper and the list of recommendations to the new administration, which was compiled by Anders, by Melinda, by John, by Sandy. Valery Kowalewski also joined the panel. Thank you very much.